Welcome to the Nonprofits, and today we're going to discuss a semi-scientific, pseudo-scientific, magical mystery tour. I'll leave the rest to Jonathan. Jonathan, what do you have for us?
This story summarizes a hypothesis put forward by a physicist who has a PhD from Harvard in physics. Dr. Michael Priva has specialties in explosives, high-pressure science, Raman spectroscopy, I'm going to make a problem with that word, infrared and nuclear magnetic resonance, and X-ray spectroscopies, and accelerator physics. He believes, note he does not profess to any proof here, that hyperdimensionality, more than 4 dimensions of spacetime, may hold the key to explaining consciousness. He expands on his hypothesis to say that string theory uses up to 11 dimensions to make it possible mathematically to exist as a viable model. That's my paraphrasing. The article says that string theory would allow for extra dimensions required for a dimension of consciousness. Is this just speculation or a daydream, or is there any there? So what do you think? The story is from earth.com by Eric Rawls on September 21st, 2024.
Thanks, Jonathan. For me, it sounded like another example, as we usually see, of religion hijacking an understanding of science, or often a misunderstanding of science, and using those scientific methods or those scientific hypotheses or theories and trying to cobble it together to explain something that religion says happened but doesn't explain. What do you think? Is that what you think that this guy's doing?
Well, when I read this article, it started out pretty good, okay, this is what, and I know not a lot, but a little bit about string theory. And yeah, there's in some versions of it, there's 11 dimensions that are wrapped tightly around strings and that sort of thing. But to say that it has anything to do with your consciousness, to me, is a huge leap with no evidence. And then he goes into and admitting that he is a Christian, he's an Orthodox Christian. And it makes me believe that this is trying to say his mythology might be true if this theory is true, but he has no evidence that consciousness has anything to do with other dimensions or what the connection is between them, and at least none that I was able to discern. And other dimensions, if they actually exist anywhere else but in the math at this point and his imagination, it still doesn't prove that consciousness has anything to do with it. The other thing is that he's not really qualified to talk about consciousness. That bothers me a lot because he has no information about brain chemistry, brain function, fMRI studies, all the current theory on that's being developed on consciousness and the brain and how that interacts and how it emerges from the complex system. So it's like they're still researching all that, but he has no experience in any of that. So how are you going to tie consciousness into abstract theoretical physics, which has not been actually proven to be correct yet? It's kind of like, okay, and quantum, they need a theory of quantum gravity to complete the unification of general relativity and quantum mechanics. But completing that we'd have the complete life, the universe, and everything. And the answer is not 42 for those of you who are fans of Douglas Adams.
To everyone who heard Jonathan say that it's not 42, just disregard that. He does not speak for the ACA or the rest of the people on this program because everyone knows it actually is 42. But,
I know somebody else who says that all the time too. Everybody knows that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, because it's true. But, I noticed that Michael implied that Jesus may be a hyperdimensional entity. I know he said, according to the Bible, Jesus ascended into heaven 40 days after being on earth. How do you ascend to heaven if you're a 4-dimensional creature? So, yeah, I'd like to know that too. So I thought they had enough trouble proving Jesus in 4 dimensions. I don't know why they're trying to throw a few extra ones on. But what do you think about him saying that, Eli? What were your thoughts?
Yeah, so firstly, I'm really kind of just hoping that the article just didn't do him justice in his argument, because I would expect somebody with such a pedigree to formulate a better hypothesis for anything, to know that, like, hey, this doesn't hold up. There's a huge leap here. And like the questions that this sparks for me is like, okay, hold on. What does I don't even know where to start. Honestly, it's so difficult. It leads me to what is the correct number of dimensions to ascend to heaven? How do you know that? How do you, it's just there's it it's really hard for me to figure out where to start. And I don't know what it is about 4 dimensions that makes you incapable of ascending to heaven. I don't know what it is about other numbers of dimensions that make you capable. And the article quotes some of Pravika's peers as saying like, well, that linking consciousness to hyperdimensionality and therefore to religious concepts is blurring the lines a little bit. And I don't agree at all. I think it's completely ignoring the lines that between empirical science and personal beliefs. He seems to have this idea that, okay, Jesus went to heaven and Jesus is different from us. How is Jesus different from us? Well, he must have more dimensions. And you just have to ask him, where are you getting that? How do you get from Jesus is different to more dimensions? We need that work in between. And maybe he has it. And like I said, the article just didn't do him justice, but it's not. It's at least not here.
If that is the best that he has to offer, he's not doing very well. But also, in fairness to the writer of the article, I don't know if I've ever heard anyone lay out anything even remotely cogent trying to rationalize a proof or evidence that Jesus ascended to heaven. Now, you might make a case for Jesus being a person that existed. That's one thing. And I'm a little dubious on that, admittedly. But when you say Jesus ascended to heaven, then you've created a whole new thing, because we know people existed. We know people named Yeshua existed in that time frame. So that's not that much of a stretch. Once we jump into heaven, we're in a whole different ball game then.
Yeah.
We don't even know what that means. Yeah, how many dimensions, as Eli said, how many dimensions do we need to go to heaven? Is 1 the Thor of hammer, and 2 Voltron's sword, and 3, how does this work? It really doesn't make a lot of sense. But honestly, one of the reasons I chose this article initially was the sheer number of logical fallacies in it. So I just want to kind of throw it out to you, starting with you, Jonathan. What are some of the logical fallacies you saw in this guy's argument? Because he really made some serious leaps. Forget God of the gaps. This is God of the dimensions.
Well, I know just a couple of them are the obvious ones: appeal to authority, hasty generalizations, like you said in your notes, and the intentional obscuring of any source of where his ideas come from as they jump from one place to another. And there's just this, a huge gap between, it's a huge red herring between this and that, it's either a red herring or just a huge non sequitur, and that's kind of like the non sequitur is probably the biggest one I see, because Jesus as a fifth dimensional being is a non sequitur from 11 dimensions and Jesus. There's how do you get there? There's nothing in between. It's like, please, just because some old mythology says something does not mean that it actually happened, and therefore you can take it and try and plug it into some newfangled pseudoscience, trying to tie it into one of many theories that are being tested to give us the parts we need to get a theory of everything. And there are other ones as well. So it's like, yeah, okay, if this one makes it easy for you to jump around and gyrate and twist your ideas to fit into even roughly into this, which I don't think it does very well. But it's just, come on, guys, you know better than this. Give us some more. Give us, do your work. Show us your work. Where did this come from? If you don't show us your work, we don't know how you got there. And if we don't know how you got there, I am really not going to believe you. So, that's pretty much all I have to say on that.
He lied it out. He covered pretty much all the logical fallacies that you saw. Or is there one that stuck out to you as well?
Well, yeah, there is. It seems like it's sort of based on this idea that I feel like I've seen a lot, where it's like, oh, well, the cause is just something that God works in mysterious ways, sort of thing, right? So this actually kind of gives me the opportunity to clarify something that I was talking about in the comments of another clip. So he kind of bases the idea that like our senses are limited. We can't sense everything about the universe, and therefore our perception is limited. So there's going to be some things that we miss, some things that happen, some phenomena in the universe that we just don't notice right away. I don't think that means that things are unmeasurable. It just means that, because like to detect, to observe something directly with our senses is not the only way to know that something exists. Like most of modern physics is either is the mathematical result of something else that has been experimentally confirmed that just has not yet been experimentally confirmed, but is close to being, or not, it's hard to say close to being, but like very likely going to be, because it fits with the rest of the theory that we have. What he has here is basically saying that like, oh, well, these extra dimensions, we just can't see them for some reason. And now he's making up that reason by saying, and a quote from the article here saying, the extra dimensions aren't easily observed because they might be compactified or curled up at scales so small they're beyond our current ability to detect. And that's just conjecture. It's honestly sort of this reskin of Turtles All the Way Down. Because if you're saying like, oh, well, the cause is something, it's just so small. Like, well, there's a cause for this and a cause for this and a cause for this. But what's the fundamental cause? Well, it's just so small that you can't see it. God works in mysterious ways. Turtles all the way down. It doesn't, like, you pick the way you want to phrase it. It's probably, I guess John did cover it. It's argument from ignorance, and they're just reskinning it in different ways.
I would have to say that for me, reading the first time, I couldn't help but think that this is pretty much a status quo. Oftentimes, Christians in particular will spend a lot of time talking about things other than their God and other than their Bible to prove their God's real, which seems odd to me, because if your God's real and so evident, it's hard for me to imagine why you need to come up with half a dozen more dimensions and abracadabra, alakazam, and here comes Voldemort. Because really, it gets to the point where you're reading what this guy says, and it sounds like mediocre science fiction. It's like, damn, I think I saw that on MST3K once. That's really the feel to some of the things he says. But I do think that oftentimes it is that attempt to avoid actually talking about their lack of evidence. And Jonathan, I was just kind of wondering what your thoughts were.
Just if you're going to write a paper, or you're going to do something that's outside your field, because there are lots of subfields within physics, and as I listed this gentleman's, it doesn't mean he doesn't have information about that. But if you're only going to list those and not the ones that pertain to the subject matter you're doing, then theoretical physics covers things like string theory, Everettian universe, things like that, various theories of everything that have not been substantially proven yet. So they call them a theory because they're well developed mathematically and they have no inconsistencies mathematically, but they're not all the same. So it's like when they finally figure out a way to test these things, we'll find out which one of these several ideas, and they may have eliminated a few by now. I don't know. It's been a while since I've been doing a lot of reading on this. But then you can probably start working on connecting the dots between biology, which is the brain and how the brain functions, and physics, which is a bunch of forces and fields and particles and things like that. But biology's macro level. A lot of what he's talking about, like of these dimensions, I think in string theory, they're tightly wound around the strings, which are a trillionth the size of anything visible with our most powerful electron scanners. So it's like, you're talking something so small, and these dimensions are supposedly intertwined and twisted around each one of these. We'll never be able to confirm or deny that, as far as I know, at least not in my lifetime, but I only got 10 or 15 years left. With all you young people, you're not going to see it in your lifetime either, so it's, unless we have, alien assistance or something. Not that I believe in aliens, but
just like before.
I mean? Just like before, right? Yeah, no, not.
It's dimensions all the way down, John.
Expansions all the way down. But so anyway, the whole idea is that how are you connecting the dots between biology and physics at this point? They're not. He's fantasizing about how, when and if they ever do that, he'll find this consciousness dimension. Well, I don't know. There may be a universe somewhere where that's true. I don't know.
Let me say this, John, and this is very important, so you should probably listen closely. My God, he can wrap strings tight around anything he wants to, whether it's turtles or dimensions. Now take that. Okay.
What did he say? I didn't hear any of that.
Can God build a guitar with so many strings that not even he can play it?
Of course, but as long as he doesn't do it, we're good. But I've got faith that the extra dimensional Jesus could play it. So that's what I would put my money on. Now,
just remember, that's not a guitar, it's a sitar. Okay, just so you know.
On that note, is there anything you'd like to close up with, Eli? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, it's kind of. I think John kind of started to touch on this. This guy, Priva, is basically just saying like, well, maybe the reason, and like we have to grant, first of all, which I didn't even say before, we have to grant that Jesus, he probably existed. I can accept that. Grant that he ascended to heaven and did all the things that he did and ascended to heaven, and then grant that the reason he was capable of doing that was because he was a hyperdimensional being, but like he's just basically saying like, well, there's probably other dimensions. Some theoretical physicists think there's other dimensions, and there's consciousness. So he's like, so what? But it doesn't seem like, and unless I haven't seen the paper, so maybe he does have some work that like mathematically demonstrates that there's some connection here. I wouldn't understand even if I did look at it. So I'm not even gonna. So I would have to find someone to kind of help me understand if that's the case. But I really think that it's so much more likely that consciousness, just like every other thing that the living things do, because to my knowledge, every example we have of a conscious thing is also a living thing. And consciousness, I think, is an emergent property of the cells that make up the organ that facilitate it, much like reproduction or digestion or excretion. All of those processes are a result of the interactions between the chemistry inside the living thing that is conducting that process. Consciousness has no reason to be any different. And as I was looking into that idea, because I've never really looked much into consciousness before. So I was looking into it like for this episode, and what I see as the primary pushback on it is like, oh, well, how do those chemical processes result in a subjective experience? And I don't see that as a problem. It seems like this, it's just the way that it is. You have, sense neurons that send signals to neurons that interpret those signals. And then you have motor neurons and other things. And you have hormones, and you have your amygdala and pituitary glands and all these things that do a bunch of different stuff in response to environmental stimuli. And eventually it starts thinking about space.
They try to give it this, how does it do this? How does it do that? How does our body define what pain is, or any of these things are? They're chemical interpretations of it. So when it comes down to our consciousness and what it's a product of, it's that same thing. It's nothing unique. There's no reason to make it hyperdimensional turtles all the way down to figure out why we're aware and who we are. Because really, when it comes down to it, I find it interesting that we have this, as you mentioned, this group of people. Well, why is it this way? Well, not knowing why it's not another way isn't a disclaimer proving that it's not that way. So until someone showed, and also the other thing being is the fact that if we damage a physical brain, we get changes in that person's awareness. We get changes in that person's personality, or what we want to loosely define as characteristics of consciousness. So if changing a physical entity can cause changes in this consciousness, what in the world could there be to imply that consciousness itself is not a product of that entity that you injured and changed that consciousness? It just doesn't make sense.
But Infidel, I like turtles.
Well, I do too.
That's why there's so many of them.
Preferably in soup. But if you don't want turtle soup, but you do want more of the nonprofits,